Okay, so again, kiddos, distance and midpoint formula today. Remember the formulas that we learned today. You do not have to memorize. You just have to understand how to plug things in. So we're going to talk a lot today about how do I identify the pieces and then plug them into the formulas. Okay, so let's start off with what our objective is. Today, we're going to talk about measuring the length of a line segment on the coordinate plane. Okay, so if you know the location of 2 points on a graph, how do I find the length between them or the distance between them? That's where we're going to start out. Okay, so distance formula. This formula is going to look a little confusing when you first see it, but just remember you're not memorizing it. You just have to know how to use it. Okay, so distance formula. This measures a line segment. Okay, finding the distance between the 2 endpoints. So for example, looking at the graph right there, okay, if I were to call this point A and this point B, then the distance formula can find the length from A to B, or the distance from A to B. Okay, now the distance formula does involve a symbol that some of you might not have seen before. Have you all used a square root? Okay, so you've seen this symbol before. Okay, now very important, you do not have to calculate the square root today. We're going to use it in the formula, and then we're going to leave our answer in the square root. Okay, so you don't even have to calculate the square root with the calculator. You're just going to leave the answer in the square root. Now, for those of you who don't know what a square root is, let's just talk really quickly about what a square root does. So if I told you to square a number, what does that mean? Multiply it by itself. Good. A square is when you multiply a number by itself. So for example, 5 squared is 5 times 5. Okay. Now, a square root is the opposite of that. Okay. So if 25 is 5 squared, then the square root of 25 gets you back to 5. It gets rid of the square. Okay. It's like adding and subtracting, how they're opposites. Multiplying, dividing, how they're opposites. The square root is the opposite of squaring something. Okay. So if 49 is 7 times 7, then the square root of 49 is just 7. Okay. Again, you do not have to know square roots today. You don't have to calculate them. You just have to know what that little symbol means. Okay, that's it. Okay, so we're going to go through a series of examples where we're going to be finding the distance between 2 points. Okay, now again, you do not have to have the distance formula memorized. I'm going to write it out for you. You just have to understand how to plug the points in correctly. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down the distance formula. Okay, so it's the square root of x2 minus x1 quantity squared plus y2 minus y1 quantity squared. Okay. Now you're probably wondering, what does x and then the little 2 and the x and the little 1 mean? Now we've used these before in the beginning of the year when we were talking about formulas with points on the coordinate plane. It's just the coordinate. Okay, so when I'm labeling my points, the first point A, remember that these are x and y, correct? And because A is your first point, it's x1 and y1, x sub 1, y sub 1. Okay, so if B is our second point, we label this x sub 2, y sub 2, or x2, y2. And it's always like that. The first point is x1, y1. The second is x2, y2. And the only reason is because A is first and B is second. That's it. Okay, make sense? Okay. Now, when we plug numbers into the formula, What we're going to do is we're going to write the formula and we're going to leave the numbers out. We're just going to write the parentheses and we're just going to write the outline. Okay. And then all we're going to do is we're going to plug numbers in. Super simple. Okay. So all you have to do is put the numbers in the right place. So what is x2? 3. So all I do in that place, I put the number 3. That's it. Okay. Now, if you want to just keep yourself organized, you can cross it out so you know you've already used it. Okay. What's x1? One more time. 4. Very good. So I put 4 right here. Okay. What's y2? 1. I write that here. What's y1? 5. Very good. And I write that there. Super simple. Okay. Now, this is the calculation part. This is where we have to be very, very careful with every step that we do. And we take our time going through these problems. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it down step by step. Okay. So let's go through and let's figure out what's in the parentheses. Okay. What is 3 minus 4? Okay, careful. 3 minus 4. -1. Very good. So that goes right there. Okay. What is 1 minus 5? -4. Okay. Okay, we're almost done. We have 2 more steps. Okay. Now we just have to square these. Okay. What's -1 times -1? +1. Very good. Okay. What is -4 times -4? +16. +16. Okay. And so our final answer, we keep the square root. 1 plus 16 is 17. And that is our answer. Okay. Now for formative today, that is what you're going to put into the answer. Okay. For the answer field, you put in the square root of 17, and I'll show you how to use the square root button on formative. Okay. You don't have to put that in the calculator or anything like that. That is your final answer. Okay. Now, distance formula requires a lot of careful steps. Okay. You have to make sure you put the numbers into the right spot. You have to really make sure that you take your time and you go through this process slow. You have one problem like this on the quiz on Wednesday. Okay. So that was our first example. Let's go through a couple more. We're going to do 2 more examples of distance formula. Okay. So they're all exactly like this. All you're doing is you're putting the numbers into the formula, and then you're calculating very carefully each step, piece by piece. Okay, let's find the distance between these 2 points, A and B. Okay, so I'm going to write out the formula. Okay, I have x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Okay, so when I plug numbers in, bless you, I'm plugging them in to this outline. Okay, what's the first thing I have to do? I have to label the points, right? So A is my first point. So how do I label this? X1 and Y1. Very good. B is my second point. So how do I label this one? X2, Y2. Very good. Perfect. Okay. So it's always XY. And because A is first, it's 1, 1. B is second, 2, 2. Okay. Now let's just plug the numbers in. What is X2? 5. Very good. Okay, what is x1? 8. Okay, what is y2? And what's y1? 4. Okay, now let's keep going. Okay, what is 5 minus 8? Careful. -3. And then what is 4 minus 4? 0. Okay, we like 0 squared because it just turns into 0. Okay, almost done. Okay, what is -3 times -3? +9. Okay, what's 0 times 0? That's it. And so this is our final answer. Square root of 9. Now, that second example was a lot faster because we're getting used to this process, but also because one of the numbers went to 0, which is always nice. Now, there are 2 possible answers for this. Does anyone know what the square root of 9 is off the top of your head? 3. So either of these answers is acceptable. Formative will mark either one of these correct. Square root of 9 or 3, those are the same exact number. They're just represented 2 different ways. Okay, so formative will mark either of these correct. Obviously, keeping it as the square root is simple. Just leave it that way and you're fine. Yes. When you square a number, it's always positive. So that negative sign doesn't matter. You're fine. I just don't like saying that because then kids forget negative numbers. Okay, so just be careful, huh? I'll trust you a little bit. Okay, we have one more example with distance formula. Okay, I just want to pause real quick. Are there any questions before we go to example 3? Okay, so the big thing I want to make sure you understand is you're not memorizing this formula. All you're doing is plugging in the numbers, right? So I don't want anyone to have any anxiety or freak out thinking that you have to have this memorized by Wednesday. You don't, okay? Okay, let me write down the formula for this one and then we'll plug the numbers in. Okay, we have x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Okay, let me write it out without the x2, y2 part, just the outline. Okay, now on this one, we're going to be really, really careful because we have negative numbers here. So we're going to be really careful on this one. Okay, so let's go ahead and plug some numbers in. Okay, before I do that, I have to label my points. So how do I label A? Very good. X1, Y1. How do I label B? Bless you. Perfect. Good job. Okay. X2, Y2. And now let's plug our points in. What is X2? 1. I'm going to cross that out because we've already used it. Now really be careful. X1 is -6, right? Okay, so I'm going to write -6. But what happens when I have 2 negatives next to each other? They become positive. Very good. So that becomes 1 plus 6. Okay, only when you have negative right next to each other. Okay, now what's y2? Now, does that negative sign turn into positive? No, it does not. Very good. Okay, and then last, what is y1? 2. Okay. Almost done. We just have a couple more steps. Now let's simplify. What is 1 plus 6? 7. Don't forget the square. Plus, what is -8 minus 2 more? Other way. -8, and then you're putting 2 more negatives on top of that. -10. Very good. okay, squared. Okay, almost there. What is 7 times 7? 49. Okay, if you don't know, use a calculator. And what's negative 10 times a negative 10? Negative 10 times negative 10, positive 100. And we add those together and we have our final answer, 149. This is our final answer. Okay, so let's go through the steps one more time just to make sure we understand. The first thing I do is make sure I have the right formula. Okay, then I label my points. After I've labeled my points, I plug in the numbers to the appropriate spots. I simplify what's inside the parentheses. I combine like terms, and then I leave my answer in the radical. Easy peasy. Okay. Now that's our first formula. Thankfully, our second formula is much easier. Okay. Now remember, you have 3 questions on the quiz Wednesday, only 3. You have 1 segment addition, 1 distance formula, and then 1 of the ones we're going to learn next, which is midpoint formula. Okay. So midpoint formula. Okay. First thing we got to do is talk about this idea of congruence. So congruent, that's one of the vocab words that we learned last week. Congruent means the same or equal length. Okay, congruent means the same or equal length. Now in geometry, we love a shortcut. So this is the symbol for congruent. It's an equal sign with that little wave on top. Okay, so when you see this symbol, it just means that the 2 segments are congruent, or 2 objects are congruent, meaning they have the same measure or same length. Okay, so how does that factor into our understanding of midpoint? Does anyone remember what the midpoint is from your vocab from last week? It's the point that cuts a segment in half, right? Exactly in half. So the midpoint divides the line segment into 2 congruent pieces. So for example, here, if M is the midpoint, then AM and MB have to be congruent because M is the middle. So if AM is 5, then what does MB have to be? Yeah. So if AM is 5, what does MB have to be? Remember, it says right here, they are congruent. It has to be 5 because they are the same. Remember, M is the midpoint. So that means whatever this is, AM, MB has to be the same. That's what middle means. We cut it in half. So if AM is 5, MB is 5. Okay, so remember that comes from the vocab that we learned last week, congruent and midpoint. Okay, now calculating a midpoint is not difficult. You just have to know the formula, and the formula is pretty straightforward. Okay, so to find the midpoint, it's a very simple idea. You're adding the x's together, you cut it in half, you add the y's together, you cut it in half. That's it. Okay, so this formula, a lot more simple because we don't have a square root. The only thing we have to worry about is the format. This is a point. Okay, so we have to write it in parentheses and it has a comma in between the 2 coordinates, right? So you have an x coordinate and a y coordinate. Okay, so again, the midpoint formula just finds the point in the middle of 2 other points. Okay, let's go through this. So we have 2 examples on this. Okay, we're going to start off the same way. We're going to write down our formula. So the midpoint formula is x1 plus x2, and we divide that by 2. We cut that in half. And then we have y1 plus y2, and then we cut that in half. Okay. So because I have a formula, what should I do with my points? Label the points. Very good. So G is first. So how would I label this? X1, Y1. H is second. So how would I label that? Very good. X2, Y2. Perfect. Okay, now let's plug in the numbers. So if I just kept the outline, it would look like this. Okay, let's go through it. What is X1? 8, very good. What is X2? 14. Okay, what's Y1? And what's Y2? Very good. Okay, and we're almost done. Okay, let's simplify. What is 8 plus 14? 22. Awesome. 6 plus 12. And now we just have to divide by 2 and we're done. So our final answer, 22 divided by 2 is 11. 18 divided by 2 is 9. And this is our final answer. Okay. So informative, you put parentheses, 11, comma, 9, parentheses. Okay, just like that. No spaces at all. Okay. Not that bad, right? That formula is a lot easier to use. You're literally just adding 2 numbers together, dividing by 2. Adding 2 numbers together, dividing by 2. That's it. Super simple. Okay, we have one more example. Okay. Any questions about that before we go on to our last example? Okay, let's try one more. Same thing. I'm going to write out our formula. So our formula for midpoint is x1 plus x2. You just add the x's together, cut them in half. y1 plus y2, cut them in half as well. Okay, so my outline. Okay, let's fill this in. We have to label our points always. A is first. Exactly. So this is x1, y1. B is second, so that's x2, y2. Okay, now let's plug in our points. What's x1? What's x2? Very good. Okay, y1. y2. Perfect. Okay, let's add things together. 3 plus 6 is 9. 10 plus 4 is 14. Very good. Okay. Now there's 2 ways that we can write this answer because 9 over 2 does not divide evenly. So we can just leave it as a fraction. You can leave it like that, 9 over 2. 14 divided by 2 is 7. So that's a perfectly acceptable answer. There's nothing wrong with that. Or you could turn it into a decimal. 9 divided by 2 is also 4.5, comma 7. Formative will mark both of these correct. Okay, so it doesn't matter which answer you enter, both of these will be marked correct. Okay, so that is today's lesson. Okay, you have your distance formula, which is what you use to find the length of the line segment between 2 points, okay, or the distance between 2 points. And you have the midpoint formula, which is what you use when you're trying to find the point in the middle of 2 other points.